for many people, Armenian or non-Armenian students or adults, works of literature and memoirs is the first way, and in some cases the only way, that they will learn about the Armenian genocide or Armenian history or Armenian anything. Although over the past 25 to 30 years or so, there's been a tremendous growth in the historiography on the Armenian genocide, which I'm sure Dikran talked about this morning, with major works published by scholars like Vahakan Dadrian, Taner Akçam, Richard Hovhanessian, Raymond Kevorkian, and others. These are books that, by and large, are somewhat dauntingly academic tomes and are definitely not geared towards the general reader, much less towards high school students. And in my work at Nasser over the years, I can hardly count all the times I've been asked to recommend a work of history on the Armenian genocide, a general history of the Armenian genocide, for the general reader or the high school student. And unfortunately, this book does not yet exist. So I can't very well recommend one. Now, survivor literature, novels and memoirs by survivors of the Armenian genocide, has been around since practically the Armenian genocide was happening. The earliest memoir in English that I know of, that I can think of right now, is perhaps Aurora Mardiganian's story, Ravished Armenia, which was published, I think, in 1918. Obviously, very, very close to the events being described in the book. And throughout and I'm just talking about English language books here, obviously Armenian and other languages is a whole other kettle of fish. But English language memoirs and novels appeared throughout the decades since 1915. For example, one published in the 1940s, I Ask You, Ladies and Gentlemen, by Leon Sermelian, was, I think, quite well known in its time, a very good book by a very good writer, and one that I think, unlike most that I can think of, actually reached a non-Armenian audience as well. Most of these, that's not necessarily the case. And if I can just speak personally, when I was growing up, which was, of course, before the growth of the scholarly work on the genocide, to say nothing of being before the internet, literature and memoirs were my way of getting into a subject that was important to me as an Armenian and as the grandson of a genocide survivor. My grandmother couldn't give me her experiences. She couldn't tell me her experiences. She was a survivor who did not speak about what she had lived through as a 19-year-old in 1915 and after. A little bit I was able to learn later. She would only talk to her peers who were also survivors, not to her grandchildren, certainly not to her youngest grandchild. And by the time I was smart enough to or brave enough to start asking questions, she was no longer around. So my introduction, in a way, to her experiences came through books such as Kara Budukian's memoir, The Urchin, also known as Some of Us Survived, and Thomas Aved's Tumas, the Little Armenian Boy. Growing up in a small town in New Hampshire, perhaps I needn't point out that neither these nor anything else about the Armenian genocide or about Armenians appeared in the school curriculum. If there was going to be any discussion of Armenian stuff in a classroom in Dover, New Hampshire, it was because one of the Mamigonian boys was doing the talking. So that's just the way it was, and I'm sure my experience in that is hardly unique. Reading William Saroyan's novel, The Human Comedy, in junior high school, I think, was the closest we ever got to discussing anything Armenian. And there was this moment of shock and recognition when there's the part in the book. Of course, it's not a book about Armenians, where they're driving and they're seeing all these different ethnic groups having their festival or whatever in the town, and boom, there's a group of Armenians. And, you know, it's almost like a moment of, you see, I'm not just making all this stuff up. It's in the book. It's actually true. And I think for Armenians, that sense of validation of one's experience is hard to underestimate. Mentioning Saroyan, though, reminds me of something else that is clear to me now that didn't really dawn on me when I was a kid and started reading Saroyan. Unfortunately, by the way, I don't think Saroyan is even read much in schools anymore. Is that correct? Yeah. Maybe something could be done about that. Can we change that? Is that within our remit to? Yeah. Well, the first Saroyan book I read probably was My Name is Aram, probably when I was in the 5th or the 6th grade, and I loved it as much then as I do now, although for different reasons. I wish it would be read in schools today. I think it's a wonderful book and a great book. Anyway, what I see now and why I'm talking about this during my time here is that I think that the book is shot through with a sense of the sadness and displacement experienced by Armenian Americans because of the genocide and the loss of their homeland. Even though it barely comes up explicitly in the book, Saroyan himself was not a genocide survivor, nor were his parents. They had come prior to 1915. Anyway, I'm thinking in particular of a story such as The Poor and Burning Arab, which if I were properly a responsible person, I would have you read right now, and then we could discuss it. I have a copy of it, which somebody is welcome to take later. The Poor and Burning Arab, which on the one hand is comical in its approach to Aram's colorful Uncle Khosrow with his loud outbursts, but on the other hand reveals the pathos of Khosrow's friendship with the Arab, who, like Khosrow, is displaced from the land of his birth and who one day simply is gone. Khosrow cannot find the words to explain to his nephew Aram, the narrator of the story. He can't find the words to explain his relationship with the Arab, with whom he simply sits in silent contemplation. They get together, they sit in a room, and they don't talk. And that's the basis of their friendship. He explains to Aram's mother, when Aram is questioning him about what is going on, "There you are, your son, my nephew, my own flesh and blood. You see, we are all poor and burning orphans, all except him. Aram, our American-born, can't understand. After some days, after figuring out that the Arab is no longer around, Khosrow explains to Aram, the Arab is dead. He died an orphan in an alien world, 6,000 miles from home. He wanted to go home and die. He wanted to see his sons again. He wanted to talk to them again. He wanted to smell them. He wanted to hear them breathing. He had no money. He used to think about them all the time. Now he's dead. Now go away. I love you." So without being about the genocide, without even mentioning it, the devastation of the genocide and the erasure of Armenians and, of course, other peoples from their homelands pervades the story. And I think you have to know the history in order to truly get the story, even though if you don't know the history, you can still get the story, but on a different level, I think. So I'd like to turn from that to briefly focus on 4 books, works of literature, and memoirs. One of them you've already heard about is the excellent book, Goodbye Antura, Memoir of the Armenian Genocide. One of them is The Road from Home, The Story of an Armenian Girl by David Kherdian. The other is Upside Down, is Forgotten Fire, a novel by Adam Bagdasaryan, and Peter Balakian, Black Dog of Fate. So The Road from Home was first published in 1979 and has stayed in print ever since then, as far as I know. David Kherdian is one of the best known of all Armenian American writers, a gifted poet, and just a very talented person in several literary genres. He closely based The Road from Home on the experiences of his mother, so much so that the book is sometimes considered a memoir, sometimes a work of fiction. I think probably if you go into the Nasser bookstore, it turns up in both sections because probably don't know exactly where we should put it. As such, it raises interesting questions about genre. Is it a memoir or is it a work of fiction? And what really, at the end of the day, is the difference between those two when we're reading them? I think that The Road from Home is most properly read as a novel, whatever that means. However, it follows many of the generic conventions of the survivor memoir. And if you've read any of these survivor memoirs of the Armenian Genocide, and probably of other genocides, they kind of follow a pattern. They provide a description of the usually idyllic life in pre-genocide historic Armenia. They chronicle the hardships and horrors of the death march and the massacres, the privations of refugee camps, and lead up to and usually conclude with the survivors' departure to freedom. I used to read all of these books, and they're all, on the one hand, the same. And then, of course, on the other hand, they're all totally different because the details and the experiences of the individual writing them and how they choose to express them is what makes each one interesting and unique. The Road from Home also engages with issues such as as I think probably all of these books do, with issues such as the pressures placed on children during times of chaos and conflict. And of course, as we were hearing and listening to Astrid, thinking of the same things, little children placed in extraordinarily traumatic, high-pressure situations, having to make decisions that no adult is really qualified to make either, but yet they have to do something. They have to make a decision of some kind. Although David Kurdian, both in his introduction and throughout his book, includes expository and explanatory material to allow those unfamiliar with the history to follow what's happening, I have little doubt that teachers would want to provide more in the way of historical context than the introduction provides or the book itself provides, and could even connect some of the places and events in the book to what's going on in the news today in the same geographical locations of Deir Zor, Aleppo, etc. There was one brief passage I wanted to read. I guess I can see that. This is at the moment, basically, when the girl, Viron, who is the main character of the book and the narrator of the book, her family is being removed from their town. It happened on Sunday. We were going to be deported, and now I understood what deportation meant. We were given 3 days to gather together our belongings and to leave. No one knew where we were being sent. People were giving things away, talking to each other in high-pitched voices, then breaking down and sobbing. I no longer remember the sermon at church that Sunday, only the sorrow in the priest's voice that he was unable to suppress. At first, I wanted to ask questions, but what was happening was just too terrible. I made myself believe that everything was going to be all right. I prayed to myself, and I tried to reason. Why should the Turks be doing this to us? Why should they drive us away from our home? But I couldn't find the answer. And so I prayed to Father God to deliver us from this evil and to deliver me from my own confusion. Of course, again, this is a literary work written by an adult man using the voice of his younger mother, his mother as a child. And he knows the history and he knows the circumstances, but she doesn't. And of course, a lot of people who are reading the book, meaning students, aren't going to know these things either. And as teachers, truthfully, I don't know how you do that in a short lesson. of whatever length. This is a problem all of us who work, quote unquote, in the Armenian world have to deal with at one time or another when you talk to people outside of that world, and you expect or you hope that they're going to understand what you're talking about. And you quickly realize that very intelligent, well-educated, and informed people don't know what you're talking about. Wait, your grandparents were living in Turkey? What were they doing there? Well, there were a lot of Armenians living there. Why weren't they living in Armenia? Well, because there wasn't an Armenia at the time. Well, that's not quite true either. There wasn't a country called Armenia at that time. Well, and it goes on, and then you realize probably you're going to end up having the same conversation with them again later, because what you've just conveyed to them is so fractured and confusing, and they don't know the history. Forgotten Fire was published 2 decades after The Road from Home, and similarly draws on the experiences of a survivor, the author Adam Bagdasaryan's uncle. So again, it's presented in the first person through his uncle, Vahan. In many ways, it pairs up well with The Road from Home. It's through the eyes of a boy about the same age as the girl in The Road from Home. And rereading this book very recently, after very many years, I found myself pondering the issue of how necessary it is for such a book to be absolutely faithful to historical facts. Again, it's a work of literature. You could say it's a work of historical fiction. War and Peace is a work of historical fiction. Does it matter that Tolstoy made up stuff about the invasion of Russia by the French? That he invented characters, that he has composite characters, that his chronology isn't necessarily 100% accurate? People probably don't get too worked up about it. When it's about something as contested in some ways as the Armenian Genocide, this becomes a little bit more complicated. So, for example, Bagdasaryan renames the genocidal governor of Van, who in real life, in real history, was named Cevdet Bey, as Selim Bey. The narrator says near the beginning of the book that there were not many Turks in his hometown of Bitlis in those days before World War I. But in fact, Bitlis was only about 1/3 Armenian, and it was about 2/3 Turkish and Kurdish. And in the course of the book, the narrator, Vahan, who was at that point working as a servant to Selim Bey, journeys with him from Bitlis to Kars, which in reality would have been probably impossible because Kars was controlled by the Russians at the time. So does this make it impossible to use such a book for teaching history, in addition to reading it as a work of literature? Is everybody, people here both English and history teachers? I mean, are there both history and English teachers here? Do we lose the history teachers?
No, the history teachers are here.
Oh, the history teachers are here. Oh, let's go get them. So what do you do? I mean, do you get into that level of minutia, or do you teach the? I'm asking the history teachers, since the.
I mean, you just gave that the narrative is a more important thing. What people are feeling. This is much more of a social history. I mean, in social history, the actual facts matter less.
Yeah.
We're not trying to tell the absolute truth. We're trying to tell how people felt back then. And this is how I use this. Well, this is I use this as a sort of a primary source. And a primary source is memory. And a primary source here is trying to get out how people felt what was going on. And yes, there may be small holes in it, but this isn't our main textbook. This is something.
So you're talking about this?
Yeah.
See, for me, what would make that not usable in my classroom is the very fact it's a novel. I don't use novels in my classroom.
Right, I see.
But I'll use a testimony, or I'll use a memoir, but I won't use a novel. In
What?
a history classroom. My colleagues in English use them all the time. but I don't use them.
Of course, as far as that goes, many memoirs contain similar
Oh, of course.
errors, right?
I know, right.
And this has been a topic of debate and discussion among scholars of genocide for a long time now. I think it's probably more settled among Holocaust scholars than it still is among Armenian genocide scholars, how to use and whether to use survivor testimonies. Well, they get things wrong. Well, yeah, of course they do, because they're human beings with fallible memories, and sometimes they're recalling things that happened long before. Sometimes they're recalling things that weren't so long before, but you still make mistakes. It doesn't seem to me to invalidate them as material. You just have to use them critically. Well, next one then. But this is a memoir. But the same issues, I think, pertain here. Karnik Panyan's memoir was published last year. Well, you've heard this already. I don't need to repeat it. I think the most interesting thing about it potentially from a teaching standpoint is that it presents a less known aspect of the genocide, which Huri spoke about earlier, the forced Turkification of Armenian children. And in the case of Panyan, this was imposed on children who, like him, were at the Antur orphanage in Lebanon, as we heard. For obvious reasons, I think, discussions of genocide, and including discussions about the Armenian genocide, tend to focus on killing and on death. But what is sometimes overlooked is that two of the components of genocide, as defined in the UN Convention, are imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. During the Armenian genocide, with the forced conversion of many women and children, both of these things occurred. And this is one of the most clear illustrations of that history that we have in English. In addition, among the many distinctive features of this book, I think, is the remarkable description of the heroism of young children. Again, the way children are being placed in incredibly demanding positions of leadership. There's a little boy in the book, a little older than Panyan, named Yusuf, an Armenian boy, who becomes sort of the leader. And I wanted to read, again, a short passage here from smaller type. Similar scenes had occurred every night at the orphanage, Panyan writes. Boys had dreamed that they were back home, woken up, and remained for a few minutes in a strange limbo between their dreams and their lives. Yusuf was the only one who didn't seem to dream of such things. He lived only in the present, with no time for flights of fantasy. At night, he often left alone, mapping the area mentally and finding new targets for our raids. Even in the morning, he often ventured outside, but always returned unscathed and unharmed, and sometimes with pockets full of carobs. Yusuf also sustained us mentally. He was a great storyteller, and he often entertained us by recounting folk tales, peppering the stories with his own embellishments and painting vivid pictures of his characters, whom we loved, whether they were good or evil. We often fantasized that one day we would be like the heroes of Yusuf's stories. We would have flaming swords, ride swift steeds, storm forts, conquer castles, and litter the ground around us with the bodies of our enemies. Then we would share our spoils equally and live happily ever after. Life on the lam taught us more than the teachers at the orphanage. We learned the basics of survival, the ethics of self-sacrifice, and the sharing of resources. Moreover, we trusted one another with our very lives. We had created our own little family of boys without mothers or fathers. The wilderness was our school, and Yusuf was our guide. I can't remember now exactly, but I think Yusuf is maybe like 13 or something. So he's the undisputed leader of this group of boys. Now, Panyan wrote this book, I would forget, but 50 years probably at least after the events. Is his memory and his presentation of his memories any more or less crafted than Kurdian's book or Bagdasarian's book, even though it's a memoir? Hard to say. Can you present in a memoir of events that occurred when you were a young child 50, 60 years before? dialogue that happened at that time, or do we just accept that that's part of the process of writing the story? I think I do anyway. When you're reading the book, you realize that this is an adult looking back on events that happened, and he's trying to make sense of them as he's writing them. It's an incredibly moving book. I really recommend it. Last book, how am I doing on time? Good. Is Black Dog of Fate, also a memoir, but a rather different kind of a memoir, by Peter Balakian. This was published 1997, I think. And the subtitle tells you basically what the book is about, as a good subtitle would, I guess. An American son uncovers his Armenian past. And basically, the book is the story of Balakian growing up in northern New Jersey in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, coming of age as an Armenian, as an Armenian, as an American, and as an Armenian American, all more or less at the same time. And his growing awareness of the history, the dark history, that no one in his family wants to talk about openly, and which he eventually has to learn independently. And how this process, in turn, transforms him into an activist for justice, for the Armenian Genocide, and for truth in history, let's say. And I don't know if this book is read in high schools much or not. I think it certainly could and should be, because the author at the beginning is really no more knowledgeable about Armenian things than most readers would be coming to the book. He knows a few words of Armenian. He isn't, as he describes himself as a young boy at the beginning of the book, but he isn't really interested in Armenian stuff. He's much more interested in playing baseball and football and hanging with his friends and rock and roll and all that sort of Americana stuff. And it's only later that he really begins to burrow into it, and the bulk of the book, or the heart of the book, is his immersion in this history and learning what it's all about and trying to figure out, what am I going to do with this knowledge and this information. It's a very powerful book. Well, let me conclude then with another personal, semi-personal anecdote that I think gets at why I think teaching this is so important, unless I don't have time. Do I have time? Okay, good. And this is just something that I learned a couple of years ago. But as I mentioned at the outset, my grandmother was a survivor who didn't talk about her experiences. And what I do know of her experiences, I only know because before she died, one of my aunts had her record her story into a tape recorder, which my aunt then translated. And a couple of years ago, I was talking to one of my cousins about this, and she said, "Oh, well, she told me her story." Really? This is a cousin who's a few years older than I am. She said, "Well, when I was in junior high school, this would have been probably in the mid-'70s, she was spending a week with us, and I had to interview someone for an assignment, so I decided to interview Auntie. And she just opened up and told me her whole story, things that she said maybe she didn't tell anybody else. I don't know." So my cousin wrote this down, wrote up the report. She was very excited about it, and handed it in to her teacher. I'm sorry, I don't know if it was a history teacher or an English teacher or what teacher. And some days later, the teacher asked her to stay after class, and she thought, wow, she must have really liked it. He handed it back to her, or maybe he didn't hand it back to her. He said, "How could you make up lies like this?"
Oh, wow.
And he ripped it up and handed it to her. And she never told anyone this until she was probably in her 40s.
Oh, wow.
She told your brother this. Your brother knew about this before I did. And she felt guilty. She said, you know, I feel like I let your grandmother down. I should have done something. She didn't tell her parents. She didn't tell my grandmother. She didn't tell anybody. You know, she had just come from Lebanon a few years before that herself. So she's a young kid, new in this country, and the teacher did this. So of course I asked the probably expected ignorant question, was the teacher Turkish? No, he was Irish or something. He just simply, apparently, didn't believe it. And he didn't believe it, I suppose, because he didn't know any better. That's the best, most charitable explanation I can come up with. And she carried that around with her for a long time. And anyway, I told her I would share that story with people when I have the opportunity, because it's a strong motivator, at least for me.